This Irishman has occupied the editor's chair at the Observer newspaper for 10 years. And the Observer, as most of you know, is the oldest Sunday newspaper in the world and is the Sunday edition of The Guardian. And for the last 5 months, he has been editing the American edition of The Guardian in New York. And he's come from New York to be with us. He's going back to New York on Monday. And it's a real delight and an honour for me to welcome him back to Dingle. Would you welcome, please, Mr. John Mulholland? John.
Hi.
Well, I suppose we should get right down to it, John, I guess, and say we sat here a couple of years ago and we talked about Brexit, and we didn't think that might happen. Mm-hmm. And we talked about the possible election of Donald Trump to the White House, and we didn't think that would happen. So you've been sitting for the last 5 months in the editor's chair in New York City of The Guardian newspaper. We'll call it The Guardian newspaper, The Guardian. From that chair and looking out your window, what are you seeing in America and what are you feeling about America right now?
Yeah, I suppose, you think, having had a fairly keen interest in world affairs and in America particularly during my time at the Observer, which would have involved commissioning hundreds of pieces about America, from America, by Americans, that you would have a very good sense of the country. And I guess I thought I did. But when you're literally kind of plugged into the mains, to continue that metaphor, you can get a bit of a shock. And I have been shocked by America. And I think the overriding sense you get is of a country which is becoming ever more polarized, and polarized obviously across politics, polarized geographically, polarized economically, polarized racially in a way that is profoundly shocking. Politics is the most obvious expression of that, but I think the mistake is to freight Trump with that. I mean, I'm sure Trump is a symptom of what has happened. He is not a cause of it. He is certainly exacerbating the sectarianism, and he's playing on that. But America's polarization started a long time ago. Newt Gingrich weaponized politics in the 90s. Fox News has played a role in the mid-90s when it came on stream. Mm-hmm. Reagan in '87 vetoed the fairness doctrine, which meant you had to give equivalent time to competing political views. Now that set in motion right-wing talk shows, Fox News, and on the liberal left, MSNBC. Mm. I mean, it is staggering to flick between Fox News and MSNBC, and they may as well be reporting on different countries. The Robert Mueller special investigation into whether Russia meddled with the US election, you watch Fox News, this Russian investigation is a total hoax, and why are we not investigating Hillary Clinton? If you go on MSNBC, it's how close will the investigation get to Trump and might he be impeached? Very little mention of...
and nothing in between?
No, now you can watch ABC News, you can watch NBC News, which is more moderate and measured, but the problem, I think, is that America's been pulled closer to the edge on both sides. And you can see it in the way sexual harassment cases are covered. Fox News talks extensively about Democratic Senator Al Franken's, the allegations against him about sexual harassment. Almost no mention about Roy Moore. There was when it first happened, but on a day last week when I was flicking between MSNBC, very little on Al Franken, almost entirely on Roy Moore. I mean, it really is shocking, but and I think it's exacerbated too by extremes being socialized and rage being socialized. So there are algorithms on Facebook that know you like sort of ragey stuff, so here's some more ragey stuff. So and Trump, of course, is exacerbating that by, as somebody said recently, making regular deposits in the bank of base. And he wants to radicalize, and Steve Bannon, people like that, they want a radicalized discourse because it will help them, and it will help if I think there's a mistake if you keep having angry outbursts at Trump, because this, it is partly about Trump, but this polarization has been going on for years. And in economics, it's growing. There are now something like 30 or 40 elite postcodes in America where most of the advantages of economic wealth are concentrating. Democratic voters are largely moving to big metropolitan cities. Of course, there are Democrats in the Midwest, but if you look at the voting patterns, there is a geographic divide that is developing, and you can see, you just look at the voting patterns and see where Democrats are congregating. There is a growing tension between the Midwest and the so-called coastal elites. So that has been, for somebody who thought he knew America well, I've been staggered by how partisan and pugilistic and sectarian the country can seem, because it also feels as though there are increasing views that you kind of are carrying as a Democrat or a Republican, and you're a registered Democrat, so it's different to floating around and voting. You are registered. And one example, which I was reading about recently, 30 years ago, broadly the same number of Democrats and Republicans felt that Russia was a threat, something like 30%. If you ask that now, 25% of Republicans think Russia's a threat, 70% of Democrats do. There are fissures developing in very significant ways, but to concentrate on Trump, I think it misses the point.
Before you went there, you clearly, the 5 months you've spent there have brought you into the heart of the matter. You seem to, just when you were observing or what was going on in America from this remove, from this side of the Atlantic, you felt when you're there, is it different? Is it, you feel it differently clearly?
Yeah,
or you see it or feel it?
Yeah. Well, I think after the first 2 months, I had a look at the things that we were commissioning, and it coincided with the neo-Nazi white supremacist march in Charlottesville, and race would be an area that I would have had an interest in. But when you're there and you see how existential the racial divide is, it really is shocking. And Charlottesville was clearly a very violent expression of that, but I suspect it is near latent and has been since the Civil War. As some people say, the Union won the Civil War, but it didn't necessarily win the peace. You look at the old Confederate states and you map over views about immigration and race. It doesn't appear as though that country is growing closer together in racial terms.
We talked a little bit outside about Ken Burns's Civil War series, but also about the Vietnam series, and seeing how divided America became. At the time of the Vietnam War, some people have observed that tumult at that particular time really drove the country apart, and we're seeing that now. Would you go along with some of that?
Well, I did when I first heard it, and then Americans have challenged back and said, America was divided 150 years ago when the Pullman riots erupted. But I thought he was onto something when he said that at that point in America, it was the first time that Americans had to ask themselves, whose side are you on? And I thought the best bits of that documentary, and I haven't seen all of it, but I did watch a lot of it. Although the filming from Vietnam was interesting, I was compelled by how he was describing the tumult in America at the time. I thought it was just fascinating how Americans lost confidence with the institution of government at that time, because it wasn't just Nixon, it was 10 years of being lied to by the American government. And the reporting on the Kent State shootings, sort of bizarre to see, and that came about, innocent students being literally just shot. It was, I knew of it, but to see the footage, you think they did that because of the kind of tension and division in the country at that time. And it does feel similar in many ways.
take us on to a logical conclusion here, maybe, if we go down the track. What's going to happen if this polarization continues, if this political polarization continues, and if this racial polarization continues? What is going to happen in America, and what will that mean, I guess, for the rest of the world and for us?
Yeah, I mean, just to spend a moment on race, because I think it is, I think it is really disturbing that it is only ever talked about in terms of shootings and violence, and there are so many underlying issues to do with economic inequality, which is heading south for African American families in America. The number of black Americans who are imprisoned, I mean, it should be a national embarrassment. 1 in 9 black Americans between the ages of 20 and 35 are in prison. There are more black Americans in prison than are at college. We had a piece recently by Paul Butler, who was an attorney, now an academic, and he wrote a book called Policing the Black Man. And one chapter, which was probably the saddest chapter, was him talking to young black males about how they should behave to avoid coming into the American criminal system. And he was saying, if you're going to walk down the footpath, don't go down in groups. If you're driving around in the car, don't go around with more than 2. Don't have the music loud. Don't wear hoodies. He was essentially saying, you need to become invisible because the American criminal justice system has a different way of identifying you. And poor urban areas are policed more heavily than white areas. So that we see is not particularly ending well, because on the other side, it would seem as though white supremacists have been given some succor by President Trump. And so when I said it's not all about Trump, he has unquestionably exacerbated this divide. And I don't think it's coincidental that some of the most significant rows he's had have been with African Americans. The row over kneeling for the national anthem, the widow of the Marine, the African American Marine who was killed in Niger, the father of the Chinese basketball, the basketball player who was released from China. He has a habit of picking fights with people who are not white, oftentimes, and that division. What happens is you start talking about those characters rather than the fact that there are more young black American males in prison than in college, and how we talked a little bit earlier about one of the reasons for that is the market, because there is a prison industrial system which has a huge investment in DC, and it has a huge investment in keeping America as the most incarcerated state in the world. America incarcerates more people by a factor of 5 or 6 than any other country in the world.
Is there anything good going on in America?
We didn't even talk about the opioid crisis.
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that. Okay, yeah. Good. No, there are. Actually, there are. In fact, I made some notes, and no, there are, and it's very important at this point to point out, and I'm sure there are Americans in the audience, that there are more good people in America than there are bad people. And it is a shame that it seems at this moment that some of the noisiest people are running the show. But of course there is a level of moderation, and some of the areas that you will see that, and I think this is encouraging. So a couple of things. America's views on healthcare is changing, and it is moving from a place where Americans felt that healthcare was a privilege to the point where they're now thinking about it as a right. And if you ask some Americans or Republicans, do they like the Affordable Care Act, they'll say, yes, I've got, it's given me benefits that I haven't had before. If you say, what do you think of Obamacare? I say, hate that, absolutely hate that. It's obviously the same act. But more and more Americans are putting pressure on the political community to say, this has to change, and a privatized medical system operated by effectively by lobbyists in DC, can't carry on. And so I think that is a big change. There is a growing appetite for more investment in education. I thought one of the most heartening things that happened last year was the bipartisan coalition that came together to protect American lands. There are public lands. There are huge tracts of federal and state lands that are public parks. I mean, huge areas. Trump signaled that he might want to open them up to oil and gas drilling. And he will do that around the fringes. But the level of bipartisan support that came out to protect something that is one of the few bits of America that isn't monetized, that isn't marketized, was reassuring.
You talked a little bit there about just education, and we've been talking a little bit here about STEM and STEAM, and just going back to your Observer days, or you're still there but on secondment to the States, on your Observer review every Sunday, which is a wonderful sort of compendium. It seems to me that it's a science and technology piece that you edit, the supplement, and it's then a very heavily sort of a culture magazine, if you like, that involves rock music and folk music and opera and all of the arts really, and fantastic book reviews. So talk to me a little bit about what you see about the interlacing, really, if you like, of the science and technology piece and the arts piece as we move a little bit forward. Yeah.
Well, I'd go back to the founding principles of the Observer when it was founded 225 years ago, and it was the first newspaper in the world that in its opening manifesto cited both the sciences and the arts. And at that time, 225 years ago, Britain was emerging into the Age of Enlightenment, the period of Western philosophy that brought out reason and logic and liberalism and empiricism bested speculation. Science was emerging, democracy was emerging, and one of the things that we've tried to do over the last 10 years is to bring science back into the national conversation, and that is not easy when a tiny percentage of British politicians have any science background. I think something like 3 or 4% at a time when science is obviously changing our lives in really obvious ways, but it's also provoking profound moral issues around gene editing and gene sequencing and many other issues. So what we wanted to do was to go back to the heart of what was the original Observer. And science and arts, as you know, are not that different. There was a talk 2 years ago at the British Film Institute with Ian McEwan and a genetic engineer, and it was a lovely conversation. It was about the similarities between arts and science, and one of them, I think it was Ian McEwan, said, what you do with your tests and your experiments is a lot like what I do with writing. You have to do 50 or 60 before you get the right result, and that's what I do with drafting my chapters. And they talked a lot about how similar those disciplines are.
Yeah, the same resource of imagination, the same failure rate, not stigmatizing the failure thing, and it's sort of experimenting and pushing out. It does seem to be the same. The condition of Irishness, John, always seems to me to be that condition of being in between, or being between, if you like, as the philosopher William Desmond says, that condition of iderathera, that we're between one thing and another, and we find ourselves geographically located between, America and Europe, but with Britain in between. We talked a little bit outside about Brexit. You're a bit removed from the hurly-burly of the detail of it. But what are you seeing from the States, and what are you feeling about how we're going to get, as an Irish person as well, how we're going to get on with each other from here on in? Some people at the States level and at the negotiation level have said that habit of partnership that Ireland and England developed together. We learned to work together in the context of Europe because we could negotiate, work with each other, and work within the 27 or 28, as it were. But now we find ourselves you know, with the 27, here is Britain, it is the one, and that things might get a little bit more adversarial, a little bit more pointy. What are you seeing about the Brexit thing from where you are?
Yeah, I mean, I am a little bit out of the swim, but I mean, not entirely. And if one has been shocked by many parts of America, one never ceases to be shocked by how poorly handled the Brexit negotiations are by the British government. And it is incredible that something that could have such a significant impact on the island of Ireland was treated so shabbily in terms of no due diligence having been done on it. And some of the statements from some of the senior Brexit ministers, you know, are shocking in their kind of platitudinous nature. And to be in a situation now where there is a government which is supplied and supported by a group on this island who will likely be
that would be the DUP.
That would be the DUP. You know, it seems to have got to a remarkable place that we all know. I mean, everybody in this room knows the work that has gone into creating a reasonably good outcome from a terrible number of years.
Well, some would say it was the best, best quality of relationship that we've had forever, really.
Yeah, and for those people to, you know, privilege their own issues of sovereignty over the possible renewed disruption on this island, it seems to me extraordinary. It seems to me extraordinary that it wasn't ever talked about in any significant way beforehand.
I wonder, James, are you here? Or do you have a microphone, James? I wonder. I'm just going to call on James O'Connor for a moment. He's wearing his hat as the president of the American Chamber of Commerce, who were here last night and had a roundtable discussion in Kerry about doing business in Kerry. And some of the things that came up were some of the things that we've been talking about. We've been talking a little bit about the Brexit thing and the ramifications of that for us here, but also, of course, just the relationship and the continuing relationship within America, which is as you're pointing out, is an America that is definitely in a state of flux, and some would say in a state of crisis. And you know, James, just wearing that hat, wearing your Microsoft hat, just to have a comment from you, please, just in terms of maybe how you see Ireland could differentiate itself in this new order of things.
Yeah, so thank you. Firstly, Philip, it's great to be here. Second year at Ireland's Edge, and it's great to be supporting him from Microsoft, and also been here as been honoured as president of the American Chamber. So, John, fascinating to hear your insights. I think to your question, I think in terms of uniqueness for Ireland and the opportunities for Ireland, there's probably a couple of things coming to mind. Listening to all the conversations today, one of the major reasons I'm here is, you know, this whole idea of how we would bring the creative and the arts and together with STEM, and particularly in terms of how do we attract more people to STEM. We know from studies right now that just within Europe alone, that by 2020 there's going to be over 500,000 ICT jobs that we can't fill right now. So there's a huge opportunity to bring more people into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths topics. But I think we need to reach out more to the arts and bring those together. We heard so many examples today of the creativity in arts and how you can do that in an iterative way. But if you bring that together with digital and the power of digital, you know, you can actually create something very, very special, and you can iterate on that. So I think for me, this is the fascination about how we bring arts together with STEM and attract more and more from the arts community, not just in the STEM, but vice versa. Like, we're in the middle of, we heard earlier this morning, Genevieve, we are in the middle of the digital revolution. I think Ireland has a lot going on in that space. There's 700 US companies based here in Ireland, which is incredible. And then we see a growing indigenous sector as well. We saw some great examples in the roundtable that the American Chamber hosted last night here in Kerry of Flexico and many others, and what the impact that has on the community. So if you can create more digital hubs in rural communities, they can act and they can actually contribute on a global level. And I think bringing together the creativity alongside STEM and then broader, intermixing the international companies that are here today, I think we have something very special. And so I'm very optimistic about Ireland being a participant leader in the digital revolution, but we have to be very clear about where we want to get after. We can't go and fight all the battles. I think we have to be very selective of where we can be centres of excellence to take that forward.
Thanks very much, James. I mean, it seems that some of the things that James is saying there, when you go back to the founding tenets of what the Observer newspaper was that we take the arts and the sciences, and as C.P. Snow said, the two cultures, and that second look in that lecture he gave in Cambridge in 1959, the beginnings of seeing if we can pull those things together. Digital change and technology has changed your world entirely, John, hasn't it? Since you began as a journalist with The Guardian, the world has changed fundamentally in every way in terms of the way you transmit your news. I'm still an old inky at heart. I buy the newspaper. I'm sort of old, lads. Right? I sort of go down to the shop and I buy the paper and I like the feel of it. But you are a digital champion, really, for The Guardian, and you saw the writing on the wall very early on. At The Guardian and at the Scott Trust, and began to say, we must change with the times, and you've been hugely successful in doing this.
Yes, and I'm just thinking about the balance sheet of The Guardian, but I shouldn't mention that.
No,
but in journalistic terms, yes, and Alan Rusbridger, the then editor-in-chief, was a little bit like John Burt at the BBC. They were both visionary in terms of knowing that even if most people wouldn't have been agreed on that at that time, was that they would have to privilege digital journalism.
Yeah.
And they placed a lot of bets and they put a lot of money into resourcing that. And look, we didn't get everything right, and The Guardian's finances have not been entirely robust, shall we say, over the last...
But it's getting better.
It is getting much better, and the new editor-in-chief, Kath Viner, and the CEO, David Pimsel, have done incredible work in...
But Catherine Viner's piece recently, her long-read piece recently, was really remarkable.
Yeah. No, it is getting better, and I think, touch wood, it may even break even in the next year or two. But Alan was that visionary, and the only thing I would say about the digital disruption, and of course it continues to disrupt us every day, and not least with what has happened with fake news. But I just wouldn't fetishize too much what digital does to journalism. I mean, journalism remains about telling stories, and as a journalist, the skills of editing, curating, verifying, presenting, I mean, they don't change. Obviously, there are new tools, there are new ways of telling stories, but the fundamental thing that journalism is I don't think it's changed that radically, although we now have fantastic and different tools to tell it. And one of the problems, I think, is that some of the skill set of old world journalism, such as curating, editing, verifying, are not being applied as rigorously in some areas.
Mm-hmm. Are you hopeful for the future?
Well,
I mean, you're going back to America on Monday, and you're going back to work. I mean, we have a couple of minutes left.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned the opioid thing, and you were in our conversation earlier on, I mean, just very, very passionate, concerned, and exercised about this thing.
I mean, look, of course you have to be hopeful, and I mentioned some things that were hopeful, and indeed attitudes to gun control are changing in terms of the amount of people who now think, well, you'd think fairly normal things like more background checks on people with mental illness, assault weapons. I mean, you might think this is kind of normal, but actually it hasn't been, and more people are now on board for a more regulated market. Opioid crisis is shocking because, and it returns to what America has to get right if I think it has a more hopeful future. The opioid crisis is notionally a crisis of opioids, OxyContin, but it's really a market crisis because that opioid crisis, which has killed 220,000 Americans, was visited on that country by one single pharmaceutical company called Purdue. And Purdue manufactured OxyContin. They marketed it in research journals that they owned, by research that they funded. They lied to the American people. They gifted American doctors with holidays. Those American doctors oversubscribed by a factor of 2 to 1 more than any other doctors. The research was a critical piece of research which said you don't no longer need to just prescribe opioids for a short time. It's now safe to prescribe endlessly. Purdue have influence at the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Some people would say they bought them off. The role of Purdue and the failure of America's politicians to regulate Purdue, this was all in open testimony in 2003 in congressional hearings. Brilliant piece in the New Yorker 6 weeks ago about the role of Purdue and the family at the heart of it, the Sackler family, who whitewashed their reputation by making massive philanthropic donations to big academic institutions across America. The opioid crisis is not a crisis of drugs, it's a crisis of the market, and America will have to get its market right before it has, I think, a more hopeful future.
Well, we just can't end on that note entirely. And I'm just going to say, but I mean, it is the role of the journalist, and it is the role of the editor to seek out these stories and to expose these particular things. And I want to say this on a personal note, and to everybody in the audience and to everybody who's listening to this and watching this live stream. When John and I met several years ago, and we were doing this little thing in West Kerry before there was broadband here, before we had the communications that we have now. I remember, John, we talked about, could we stream what we do here to The Guardian? And John was amenable to seeing if we could make this work. And it really does go back to the ladders, the hammers, the nails and the wires. But I remember we were standing at the back of the church of St. James some years back, and you had a BlackBerry, and you said, oh, look, they're looking at this in Australia, you know, they're looking at this in Canada. And I just want to say to you, thank you for that, because it was a sign and a signal that from this particular place we could do something and we could speak to the world from here. And I'm grateful to you for that. So I just wanted to say thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, John Mulholland. Is that okay?
Yeah,